campaign to silence the press and other independent media sources is a feature, not a bug. And it's a feature that other elected autocrats around the world have harnessed to quash dissent. Tech barons from Meta's Mark Zuckerberg to Google's Sundar Pichai to Amazon's Jeff Bezos joined Musk on stage at Trump's inauguration and made hefty donations to his inaugural committee. These men have wilted under the president's strongman tactics, acquiescing and uplifting his propaganda in exchange for government contracts, regulatory favors, and, in Zuckerberg's case, to avoid Trump's promise to jail him. The president is simultaneously suing and encouraging the FCC to revoke broadcast licenses held by major mainstream media conglomerates like ABC Disney, NBC Comcast, and CBS Paramount. He's calling for the defunding of NPR and ejecting even the most established news organizations like AP and Reuters from the White House press pool for merely refusing to parrot his propaganda. FBI Director Kash Patel once said he would, quote, come after journalists for reporting critical of President Trump. Trump's FCC and FTC chairs have promised to force social media sites to host the same kind of hate and lies that have underpinned every modern and not so modern authoritarian takeover. Those who study the rise of authoritarianism, including many of our experts here today, share that it's often a gradual process that happens within and under a legal facade. Democratically elected leaders deliberately dismantle democratic norms and institutions until political power is concentrated in one party or one person. Media freedom and civil society spaces are typically attacked first. But as we're seeing this week, nobody is immune from attacks, including judges and elected officials from across the political spectrum. Anybody who is willing to stand up for democracy can become a target. So it's critically important to remember that we, everyone on this webinar today, are powerful. If we weren't, they wouldn't be trying so hard to silence us. We, the media, we, civil society, we, government leaders, and we, the people. We have the power to bend the arc towards justice, but we must be brave and we must act now to demand our freedoms. To shed more light on what we can do together, Free Press and the Global Project have pulled together an incredible lineup of experts who've lived through authoritarian regimes across the globe and can help us make sense of this moment. We have Dr. Heidi Beirich, co-founder and chief strategist at Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, Dr. Andras Bironag, director and owner of Policy Solutions, who can help shed light on Hungary's democratic collapse, Dr. Rafał Pankowski, professor at Collegium Civitas in Poland and co-founder of Never Again Association, and Maria Ressa, co-founder and CEO of the Filipino news site Rappler. Maria won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 for safeguarding free expression. These courageous leaders haven't just studied far-right movements. They've challenged them head on. For doing so, they've faced death threats, civil and criminal lawsuits, jail time, and more. But they've also been at the forefront of defending democracy. So I want to thank them so much for their work and for being with us here today. We'll have a panel discussion now for about the next half hour, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Please do use the Q&A function on Zoom at any time to pose your questions. If you're tuning in on the YouTube live stream, please use the chat function there to get us your questions. So with that, I'll turn it to my co-host, Heidi Beirich. Heidi, you've studied far-right extremist and anti-democratic movements in the US and abroad for decades. Many Americans think of authoritarianism, fascism, dictatorships as foreign problems. But I think you tell me the US is no stranger to these evils. Can you give us a basic primer on these terms and help us understand better what's happening here in the US right now?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Free Press, for making this happen. It's just so absolutely important. I'm going to lay out a few factors that are related to authoritarianism because I think when people talk about the US going down an authoritarian path, people sometimes don't understand what that means, thinks the argument is overblown. They don't understand that there's actually a playbook, a set of factors that happen as you backslide into authoritarianism and leave democratic norms. So I'm just going to go through these one at a time. And the pattern to these things has held across time and regimes. Um, so there's one of the first things that happens as you move towards authoritarianism is the politicization of independent institutions. Jessica's already mentioned some of those. Every democracy has certain institutions, traditionally here in the United States, the Department of Justice, law enforcement, the central bank, and so on, that have a certain institutional independence from the political process. And one of the things authoritarians do is capture those organizations and turn them into political operations. We're seeing that now with Trump in almost every single institution that had some independence. The Department of Justice is being politicized. The FBI is now headed by a conspiracy theorist, and agents are being let go who investigated January 6th. You talked about the FCC, Jessica. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is being shut down. I think of all of this, what's most concerning is what's happening at the DOJ, because prosecutors who are involved in Jan 6 have been fired or will be. And there's been a lot of talk about moving the agency away from things like white collar crime and bribery and using it to investigate people that Trump doesn't like. That's a big problem. So I should just say too, if you want to dig into this further, Project 2025's book, The Mandate for Leadership, basically lays out all of these things. All of these policies were preordained before Trump ever went into office. Another thing authoritarians do, usually very effectively, is spread disinformation. This, of course, has been made all the easier with the kind of collapse of content moderation at the tech companies. But this is a strategic thing. They spread falsehoods to shape a reality that isn't there and to deceive. Everybody thinks about Hitler's big lie, but Trump has lied about elections, immigrants, crime, government waste, a whole bunch of other things to shape a reality that doesn't exist and to demonize vulnerable populations. Aggrandizing executive power is key to authoritarianism. Obviously, the word itself tells you that this is about one person capturing as much power as possible. What Trump has been doing lately is to take as much power into the executive office as is possible. So that has to do with shutting down agencies, putting cronies in high positions, trashing the civil service, which had independence, trashing independent agencies, independent operators, and sending his friend Elon Musk in there to fire people, meddle with personal data. This is a theory in the conservative movement that you need what's called a unitary executive, where the presidency becomes the most powerful branch of government. And this is what we're heading to, slamming through checks and balances and all of this, turmoil in the federal government. Trump also, with getting rid of funding agencies like USAID, cutting contracts, is invading Congress's space as the one who decides what we spend our money on here and what is appropriated for. So he's undermining one of the branches of government. Quashing dissent is another element of authoritarianism, whether that's going after specific individuals, which Trump has done on many times, threatening the media in various ways, individual journalists, threatening lawsuits, threatening to defund NPR, politicize Voice of America, threatening NGOs with investigations. In the most extreme form, there's been talk by Trump and some of his allies about using the military against protesters, the Insurrection Act. All of this is part and parcel of moving towards authoritarianism. Corrupting elections is key. As Jessica mentioned, what usually happens is an authoritarian leader is elected legitimately, but then they go about doing all these things to take you down an authoritarian road. Part of that is messing with the election system. So January 6th and the lies about the 2020 election are clear signs of authoritarianism. And the party, the GOP, has gone along right with all of this, many cabinet appointees refusing to say that Biden won in 2020. But there's also restrictions on voting, right? Various ones, voter ID, purging electoral roads. This is something the GOP has played out for a while before even Trump came along. And now we're hearing talk about things like a third term for President Trump. There's also the defunding of CISA, like things that protect us in elections from cybersecurity. Luckily, many elections are run, I mean, elections are generally run by the states, so there is a little bit of a protection here from these actions. Of course, we don't, the GOP can do all kinds of things at the state level. All right, just two other things. Scapegoating vulnerable populations. Demonization of communities is key to authoritarianism. And frankly, there's too many communities who've been targeted to even list them. Mexican immigrants are poisoning the blood of Americans. They're rapists. Attacks on DEI. No discussion of slavery in education. Don't talk about white supremacy or Jim Crow. The attacks on the LGBTQ, especially the trans community, have been horrific. This is all part and parcel of authoritarianism. And just finally, another key factor, stoking violence. The pardons in particular, where really horrible people with long rap sheets were let out of prison, not just for January 6th, but for all kinds of other crimes, is part of stoking violence and sowing fear among populations that white supremacists and militias target. Ignoring the threats from white supremacy now by closing down extremism and getting rid of extremism in the military and possibly shutting down the FBI's work on that part. That's part and parcel of stoking violence. And personally threatening people from Lynn Cheney to Hillary Clinton, using violent imagery online, all of that is part of the authoritarian playbook. And with that, I'll move on. We can move on to our other panelists who I'm so happy are here.
With that, yeah, with that small collection of information. Thank you, Heidi. I wanna bring Andras in here. Andras, you not only study far-right movements, but you've also been on the front lines of challenging Hungary's descent into authoritarianism under Viktor Orban's rule. Like President Trump, he was elected, but now he's widely considered an authoritarian. Can you help us better understand how Hungary broke down, and in particular, how Orban captured the media? And what are you seeing that's similar in the United States or different?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the kind invitation to Jessica and Heidi. Hungary's journey into an electoral autocracy started 15 years ago in 2010, when Orban's Fidesz party got back into power. I think the Hungarian example is nowadays considered as a textbook example of democratic backsliding, a textbook example of how a democratically elected leader can systematically dismantle the institutions that are meant to keep power in check. What I have to add is that democratic backsliding doesn't happen from one day to another. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated strategy through 15 years, with many elements of that playbook that has been mentioned by Heidi before. And this playbook included, in the Hungarian case, a new electoral system that favored Orban's Fidesz party. It included the capture of independent oversight institutions, from the Constitutional Court to the Media Council and State Audit Office, and I could go on for a long time. It also included an attack on the independence of the judiciary. It also included pressure on civil society and academic freedom. But moreover, I have to add that the control of media also played a central role in this process. Orban understood quite early that in order to consolidate power, he needed to dominate the flow of information, and he did it in three key ways. First, Orban turned the state-run media into 24/7 propaganda machine, without an exaggeration. Second, the Fidesz party built up a huge media empire, which nowadays consists of more than 500, and it's not an exaggeration, it's approximately 500 media outlets that are serving now the purpose of propaganda in the Hungarian case. And the third element was silencing dissent, or at least trying to silence dissent through economic and legal threats. Nowadays, I think it's safe to say that the large majority of Hungary's media is under the control of the governing party. And the result is a media landscape in Hungary where the huge conservative media ecosystem dominates the airwaves and echoes the government's position, while critical journalism is clearly discouraged. Altogether, I think the Hungarian example shows us that once a government claims control over media, reversing the course becomes very difficult. And the reason why I'm saying this is because misinformation becomes the norm, basically. Accountability for those in power becomes weaker. And also, opposition voices may be even considered as threats to the national interest. So the persecution of opposition voices can clearly become part of the agenda. If we compare all this to the US, despite the unfavorable tendencies in the US, I think that press freedom is still in a much better shape than in Hungary or in the Philippines for sure. But we also see some patterns that are familiar to us. So from Hungary, when we see that the president is discrediting independent journalism as fake news, it's something that we also hear from our prime minister. When we see billionaires buying up media outlets to shape narratives, it's something which has happened with the oligarchs close to Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And we also see in the American case an increasingly fragmented and polarized information space where trust in traditional institutions is eroded, which leaves people vulnerable to manipulation. But the good news for you, what I have for you from Hungary, is that the US is not Hungary. So that the US still has a very robust system of checks and balances. Independent media is much stronger than in our case has ever been, and civil society remains strong. So my message of hope to the US is that Hungary is a cautionary tale and it's not necessarily an inevitability.
Thank you. I think a lot of us are feeling the need for that message of hope. We really appreciate it. I'm also seeing in the chat a lot of people asking, what can we do? We are going to get to that. I promise. We also had a request someone note that they were a little hard of hearing. So we have turned closed captions on. You should be able to see those now. I want to turn to Rafal next. Rafal, in Poland's 2023 election, you were part of a movement that defeated the far-right PIS, a right-wing populist and national conservative political party. What did you endure to advance your research and political activism at the time? And how did the opposition come together? What did journalists, activists, and leaders do?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel with very eminent friends and colleagues. I appreciate the subject is very important, and in some ways, Poland, of course, is similar to Hungary, with the exception of what you just mentioned. The fact that the far right was actually defeated after 8 years of what we may call a very severe crisis of democratic culture and democratic values. But I think, yes, in some ways, Poland can be a positive example, a hopeful example, with the exception or with the footnote, if you like, the far right hasn't been defeated completely, and it's still out there. It is still very strong, and I don't want to say it is very likely to come back, but it may well be the case. I have to note that Poland is a country in the region of East Central Europe with a rather strong tradition of civil society activism, human rights activism, pro-democracy movements, and I think this is something that produced the result we had in 2023. Yes, the far right had a genuine base of popular support, which cannot be denied, but the counter movement also had a very important base of support rooted in a certain tradition that has been very important in this case. But what we really experienced, what we really witnessed for all those years, was the vilification of minorities as a pattern, as a method, as a strategy of mobilization of support for the ruling party. And those minorities ranged from the Jewish people to LGBT, to Muslims, refugees and migrants, but the method remained very similar, and the tools were very similar to what we just heard: the state-controlled media, the social media platforms that became a major tool of far-right mobilization and vilification of all those minorities, but also the assault on the rule of law, the assault on the freedom of the press, and also we saw a very strong movement against the freedom of civil society. And I think, well, what was very important in our case was the factor of luck, which I wish to everybody, but it cannot be counted for forever. And I think, yes, we managed to beat the far right, if you like to use that phrase, for now. But I would not say that Poland is a super shining example of a wonderful victory of democratic culture over the forces of evil forever. Because what I think is a problem we are witnessing ever since is the fact that the culture of the far right, the culture of the vilification of minorities as a political tool, has actually poisoned the political spectrum beyond the far right, and I'm afraid this is a bigger problem that we are still going to confront, and especially now. Of course, we know no country is an island. We are all interconnected. This is a global problem, and witnessing what we are witnessing in the US, of course, it has global repercussions, and also in our region, and not least in the context of what is happening next door in Ukraine. This is something that I think many people in Poland and in our region are very seriously concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafal. I really appreciate that reflection. Let's get Maria in here. Maria, you won the Nobel Prize for your journalism and courage in holding former Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte accountable. You literally wrote the book on how to stand up to a dictator, but it wasn't without great personal cost. Can you walk us through what it was like to run a news organization and report on an authoritarian regime? And can you offer some reflections on how President Trump's attacks on the press look similar or different to what you saw under President Duterte, and what role the press should play in this moment? That's a lot of questions.
Well, look, let me just say I feel like I'm living through this twice. And the playbook is the playbook. Our countries all have certain patterns that have been followed. We can list them. In fact, I'll put in a list of 10 things that have happened that break down institutions in the Philippines. Within 6 months, Rodrigo Duterte in 2016 crushed the checks and balances of institutions. And why is the Philippines interesting to America? Because our history in a nutshell is like 300 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood. We were colonized for 300 years by Spain and then colonized by America. Our Constitution is patterned after America. It's got 3 branches of government, a very strong executive, and we have had a dictator twice. And so I didn't understand the first Marcos. He was ousted in a people power revolt in 1986. I didn't understand. I was like, how could Filipinos have allowed this to happen, until I lived through it in 2015 to 2016. 2016 was when it began. And what you're seeing is exactly that. Think about it as death by 1,000 cuts, that, you know, every single move, what Heidi described for you is like a slight cut and you're bleeding. And since it's only a paper cut, you're thinking, I can still keep going, I can ignore it, but you're bleeding so much that at some point the body politic dies, right? So on the media, look, Rappler was the third, at that point, the 3rd top online news site. We're now the top, you know, in terms of digital only. But at that point, we had just opened a Jakarta bureau. We had expanded into Indonesia. And the first thing that happens, you've heard this earlier, the first thing that happens is access. Crazy rules, kind of like the Gulf of America, you know, where you have to literally hold the line, because every time you give up your rights, you're pushed back further. And I think what happened in Rappler was we held the line and we're still alive. I'm not in jail, but I will say our largest broadcaster tried to look for a way forward and lost its broadcast license, right? There are many ways to rationalize. When you live through this, you realize that rule of law is an agreement. And when the people who are in charge of implementing rule of law don't, you really actually don't have much that you can do, especially if they have the police and military behind them. That's another crucial lesson from the Philippines. So let me just say, in terms of journalism, you know, social media was a critical factor, the attacks online. And this began even years before I actually got arrested in 2017. They began attacking me with 90 hate messages per hour, but with a meta-narrative that said, you know, hashtag journalist equals criminal. That was what journalists were being attacked. So the first thing that's being attacked is reputation. And then the pro-Duterte networks, you see these already. Obviously, Elon Musk leads in this, but what happened was the pro-Duterte networks then began saying hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. It was like fertilizer. I didn't get arrested, who would have thought, until 2019, 2 years later. And you in America are far more accelerated than we've been, because you've just passed the first month. So what happens on these attacks online? Then about a year later, in 2017, the investigations began in Rappler. We weren't the first news group attacked, but we were 3rd, the top online, the top television station, the top print, the top newspaper, and then we were the top at that digital. But what happened then was the top newspaper immediately said they would sell to somebody friendly to the administration. And you'll find many businesses doing this, because it's, Tim Snyder says it, obey in advance. The second, that newspaper didn't do this finally in the end, but the second one was the television station lost, ABS-CBN, which is a news group of 1,000 people I used to manage, lost its franchise. We call it a franchise, you call it a broadcast license. So in 2017, 21 investigations. So lawyers, like, we didn't even have a legal officer. All of a sudden, I was spending all my time on legal cases. And then 2018 was the first time the government tried to shut us down. Our SEC came up, and we were so incensed, the journalists, because we were old enough, that we held a press conference and forgot to tell our lawyers, because it was just ridiculous, right? It was ridiculous. And it was a good thing we did, because if you don't, you Silence is complicity. You give in. And so we kept fighting. By 2019, and I'll remember the date, I got arrested February 13th. I posted bail February 14th, my Valentine's Day gift. And then for the next year and a few months, I got 10 arrest warrants. And what year is it now? 2025? I still have 2 left. So here's the good side, right? A lot of whether America survives this will depend on what you do now, because that will draw your line. So I would say we have to hold the line on our rights, right? Every day you do not act means you get weaker, like blood pouring out of the body politic. Rodrigo Duterte stayed for a 6-year term, and he used a brutal reign of killings in a drug war. And fear works, and money works, patronage politics. If, in some ways, when the government is corrupt, it's much easier. It's a quid pro quo. That's all it is, right? You don't have to worry about anything else. But what happened is, at the end of those 6 years, our military didn't back it. There is always an attempt. There were lots of attempts to try to actually extend it. So at the end of 6 years, he was gone. And that was when I began winning my legal cases, so I'm technically on a travel permit from the Supreme Court and there's certain restrictions of that. But since the Nobel Prize in 2021, I've been allowed to travel again. You will lose some rights. And being silent means you're actually helping give away your rights.
Yeah. I have to tell you, Maria, as you started to lay out what unfolded for you, it made my stomach turn a bit, because we are seeing so much here of attacks on rights, of fear, and people are understandably, we're not used to this here, understandably afraid to speak out because people's life and limb and financial wellness are at stake. And I'm really inspired by your call to hold the line. And I think what we'd like to do next before we go to Q&A is just take a minute and hear from all of the panelists, maybe in reverse order. Go back to you first, Maria, but just give us a minute to really make that tangible for us. What does holding the line look like? What can we, the people, do? What should elected officials be doing? What should journalists be doing? Because like you're saying, Maria, we've seen a number of media corporations already trying to acquiesce to the president. And has the president backed down? No. Their licensors are still being scrutinized. There's still a proceeding, even though Mark Zuckerberg went on his campaign to prove he's really macho and aligned with Trump. There's still a proceeding at the FTC about tech censorship. So what does it look like for business owners, for everyone in civil society to hold the line? We'll go to Maria and then back the way we came.
Yeah, I've thought about this a long time, and the book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator, was actually a warning to the rest of the world, because this tech-enabled, and we're headed towards a fascist world, right? And I don't use the word lightly. Madeleine Albright pushed me to use that word, actually. But look, I think the first thing is, in that book, you come out with one question. And it is a person-to-person question, because what tech enabled is the manipulation, the insidious manipulation of the cellular level of our democracy, meaning you and me, right? And if that is possible, then reclaim your rights. And how do you do that? One question: what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? Because that is the foundation of everything, right? Democracy is built on truth. So I say this these are like the 3 sentences I've said over and over. Social media spreads lies faster than facts. If you incite fear and hate, it spreads even faster, right? But if you don't have facts, you have nothing, because if you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these three, we have no shared reality. We can't begin to solve climate change, let alone journalism or democracy. It goes really quickly. So I always end with the three things for every person listening. Don't waste time. Number one, draw the line. What are your personal lines, right? Where on this side, this is the world you want to live in, and you cross over, this is a dystopian world you cannot live in. The second, go back to the Constitution. What are your rights? Hold the line. And then the third, tell your family and friends. Now I sound like Mark Zuckerberg. No, tell your family and friends. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. There's so much more, but distilled, it is person to person. And the last part is, it's not going to be easy. There was a moment in time when I was facing cumulatively from the 10 cases, 103 years in jail. And who knew, it was in the middle of a COVID lockdown. And there was a point when I put cameras everywhere because I was like, what will happen? Anyway, I took them out because it was really painful to deal with it. I guess I'm just saying that so much is at stake for America. And because it's America, for the world, it flips the world upside down. So ask yourself the question, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth?
Thank you, Maria. Really powerful. Rafal, let's bring you in here. What is your advice?
Well, thank you very much. And of course, I could not agree more with every single word that Maria just said. And I'm so lucky to be with you and hear those words. Very important, very meaningful. I think what it inspires me to mention is something that we heard from someone who just recently died, and he was buried on Sunday. It was a very sad occasion for me personally to attend that funeral of a good friend of the Never Again Association. His name is Marian Turski. He was a very well-known Holocaust survivor and a survivor of the Auschwitz camp, who was 98. But very active until the last days. And just a few years ago, he gave this very memorable speech at Auschwitz on the anniversary of the liberation of the camp. And I think there is just one line in that speech that resonated with many people, especially at that time. He said, in addition to the 10 commandments, there should be an 11th commandment. Don't be indifferent. Don't be indifferent to the vilification of minorities, to the authoritarian, totalitarian, fascist tendencies. And I think this one short and simple phrase, don't be indifferent, really inspired and has inspired a lot of the positive movements in Poland and elsewhere in defense of human rights and democratic freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Andras?
Yeah, I fully agree with what we have heard from Marisa and Rafal, and I would like to follow from the line, don't be indifferent, and especially when independent media or civil society is under attack, is attacked by the political leaders. I think it's absolutely vital from concerned individuals to support causes, to support human rights NGOs, to support independent media outlets. I think this is at least something which we certainly very much need in the Hungarian context, where, for example, the Hungarian Prime Minister feels emboldened by the re-election of Donald Trump and goes after the NGOs and the independent media even more than before. For example, the Hungarian government is going after all the organizations that have received support from the USAID in the previous years. So following the Trump tornado, an Orban hurricane is on the horizon for us. So we will see how it plays out in reality, but the threat is real. And I would like to also highlight the importance of what Maria has said about collaborations. I think that building local communities and being active in their own neighborhood and among friends and family and so on is also very important in a situation when from the national level, the only thing that comes is pressure.
Thank you so much. Heidi, we're going to close with you and then go to questions.
Yeah, I'm just going to say something, quickly. Americans were not prepared for this, did not understand this was coming, and naively thought it couldn't, happen here in the US. And one of the things that people know from studying authoritarian regimes is, and as Maria has talked about death by 1,000 cuts, if we allow ourselves to stay in this position of fear or our head in the sand or avoid speaking out right now, we're going to lose this democracy even quicker. So we cannot obey in advance. What Bezos and Zuckerberg and others have done is absolutely shameful. And we have to speak out. And I know this is really hard to do when people are scared. Whether it's on the local level, like Andras was talking about, which I actually think is really, really important, or it's small protests against Doge cuts, or it's speaking out in any way, shape you can. We've got to understand that if we don't do this right now, it's not going to be easy or easier to do it 6 months from now. And it's going to be worse a year from now and a worse 2 years from now. And one of the keys to stemming authoritarian decline is by holding the line. So I just want to encourage everybody to think about that. I know it can be scary, but we've got to do it, or it's just going to get worse for all of us, especially communities that are being targeted.
Yeah. Relatedly, so that ties in actually to a question that we got from Karen Byrne. She said, James Carville has come out and said that we need to just sit back and watch it play out, and that the Trump administration and the Republicans will suffer at the hands of the electorate. I think what I'm hearing all of you say, experts on authoritarianism, Karen says, all of you have said that the beginning of an autocratic takeover is one of the most critical times, and that's when we need to be the most active. Which approach is better? I think I know what you all are going to say, but just anyone who wants to come in and tell us why now, what is the progression that we will see if we don't get out and make some noise? Maria, yeah.
You will get weaker over time. The more, so not actually speaking, not exercising your rights, literally not only makes you complicit in what is happening today. It's almost like if you see someone getting mugged on the street, are you going to walk away, or are you going to call the police, or are you going to help? These are tough questions. This is why it becomes individual. But that's exactly what happens then is whatever is being destroyed now is not going to magically appear later, right? So it's not in your head. The way the Constitution with its checks and balances, at a certain point, those checks and balances disappear and power is consolidated.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria. Does anyone else want to get in there, or can I go to another question? We have so many. Here's another one. A number of participants have asked about media failures in times of authoritarianism. We're seeing this now with Jeff Bezos shutting down dissenting voices at Washington Post. How did your countries avoid media capitulation? Some of you talked about it a bit, but what would you recommend that we do here in the US? I know Free Press, we do media reform, and we have a number of folks, I think, who are joining us who run actually independent media outlets. What is your counsel to them and to folks who want to support independent media?
I hate to, I keep
I'll
speaking.
come to you, Maria, but I might want to bring Andras in here as well, because you had some observations about US media and how it looked different than in Hungary.
No, actually, I'm not sure that I can provide the right answer to this, because in Hungary we haven't been very successful in standing up against the Orban government's aims in this field. What we see is that if the government-related oligarchs are allowed to buy whatever they want, because there is no alternative financial resources to keep up the operations of other media, then these media become vulnerable, and then the rich people surrounding the political leader can come and buy up, and then afterwards even close down some important media. This is what happened in the case of Hungary's highest circulation daily newspaper, which was first bought by government-related oligarchs, and then it was shut down by the Orban government. So it's something similar in the US would be if, for example, a government Trump administration-related oligarch would buy the New York Times and would close it down a year later. This is something that has happened in Hungary, and of course, what I can recommend is that all those who have the money and who are not related to politicians with authoritarian tendencies should stand up and use these financial resources in order to keep independent media flowing.
Yeah, I might just jump in here and bump past to Maria, because this is something Free Press has worked a lot, which is who owns the media and structural. And in the US, we actually have limits on how much media any one entity or corporation or individual can own, right? It's why back in the day, Rupert Murdoch didn't run and buy up every local broadcast station, but we actually are hearing that our Congress plans to perhaps get rid of limits on national ownership caps. We've heard the FCC and Brendan Carr, the FCC chair's part of his plan is to get rid of limits that limit one entity buying up all the local media. And we've opposed that because we think of the diversity of voices is important for a lot of reasons. And one of those being this. So if you do sign up, if you want to hear particularly, we have actions that are being put out every week at Free Press. We have an SMS, a text list. If you text freedom to 78748, and I'll repeat it a few times, and someone here will put it in the Q&A as well so you can see it. We have a group of folks, a list of over 1 million folks who take action on a regular basis when bad legislative or regulatory proposals are coming down the pike. So we're happy to help everyone exercise their right to speak up in those proceedings. But I want to go to you, Maria, because this question is particular to the media and what you did to effectively continue to get the message out.
There's so many things. Early in the time period when the cases were coming, I said that there's a chilling effect, which everyone feels now, right? There's a chilling effect because you don't know what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. There's just that. But I would say, Jessica, one last thing is that social media now is also media, right? And the social media control has already been, it's owned. Like one company is owned by one man. We've talked about the broligarchy and this is the beginning. That was the spark, the match that was thrown into dry kindling. So at the beginning, first think this is always about power and money. It isn't just autocracy, it's kleptocracy. And that's what we've seen in different parts of the world. And if you're a journalist, I would say, don't normalize he said, she said. This is when you have to literally shoot and call a spade a spade. If it violates the Constitution, you can ask a judge. You can ask a lawyer. But I think one of the other things, and President Duterte did this really well, he would have daily rambling press conferences. And he would admit he's on fentanyl, by the way, while he's doing this. And then the journalists would be running around like crazy, following. We stopped building on investigative cases on each other, which we need to keep doing so that you expose what's literally happening under the surface. I talked about the 3 C's. This is the first thing they do to journalists: coerce, co-opt, corrupt. Coerce, co-opt, corrupt. The 3 C's, we saw it happen. I think the reason why we were able, Little Rappler, we're about 120 people. We started this. I was already, we were old. 4 or 5 of us were about 40, and then we hired the smartest 20-somethings we could find. And we owned no other businesses. And I figured if we stood up, we needed to stand up, especially when I got arrested. I was like, oh my God. And because that's the moment when it matters. I'll say the one last thing, which is, I guess this moment is critical because everything that you somehow have to consolidate focus. And that goes back to civic engagement. One of our other initiatives in the Philippines was literally to begin a facts first PH. It's not all political. I mean, you could take the position that everything is political, but you could also take the position that everything is about facts, which is what we did. And when we did that, what we did was we literally, by organizing ourselves online with business partners, with NGOs, we were able to capture the center of the information ecosystem. I'll just end with one last thing that every autocratic system has had, and probably Russia is the best example of this. In Marichka Shaka's latest book, it's called The Tech Coup. She just goes over what we've all gone through, which is first, there's capture of media. After capture of media, what's next? NGO capture. After NGO capture, academic capture. And then if you look at South Africa, even South Africa had state capture, right? So it's the corruption of every institution.
Yeah, including businesses that aren't media too. We have a question coming in from Nick Riccardi from the Associated Press. He was asking all the panelists to speak to whether the leaders in your countries clashed with the judiciary, and argued that the judges did not represent the people and therefore their rulings didn't need to be heeded. We've of course seen Donald Trump and Elon Musk argue this in the last few weeks. And so maybe I'll kick that to you first, Rafal, and then Andras and Maria and Heidi. I know that you're kind of tracking this globally, so maybe you can come in at the end and let us know where you've seen this or if you've seen this.
Well, I would say this is exactly what we heard in Poland over and over again from the very beginning in 2015, when the democratic backsliding really had a very sort of sharp start, and in fact, among the first big protests against the democratic backsliding, a very important protest occurred in defense of the independence of the judiciary. And I think for all those years, and especially in the early years, the protests against the clampdown on the independence of the judiciary, that was one of the main fronts in if you like, in the battle in defense of democratic values. And in some ways, all of a sudden, judges became the sort of frontline activists in defense of democratic values, which I think in some ways was surprising even to themselves, because that's not what they expected to be. But I think what gave them the courage, or helped them have the courage, was the movement of the citizens who supported that fight, also in the streets, in the form of mass marches and demonstrations. And I think over time it became difficult for people to follow the technicalities of the legislation, but the instinct to defend the independence of the judiciary, that has been one, still is one of the main instincts behind the democratic movement and the movement in defense of democratic values. So I couldn't agree more with the with the sentiment mentioned in that question. Thank you.
We'll go to Andras.
Yeah, just very quickly. Independence of the judiciary was also a critical issue during the last 15 years. There was a major clash between the European Union and the Hungarian government because the main aim of the Hungarian government was to change the leading judges in the country by forcing the older judges into retirement. So imagine that's another element from the playbook, to change, for example, the retirement age of judges from 70, which was in place in Hungary, to 62 from one day to another. So all those judges above 62 had to go into retirement afterwards in Hungary. And after the European Union's actions, Hungary had to raise back the retirement age of judges to 65, because that was the universal retirement age in Hungary. But by that time, after 3 years of judiciary clashes, all those judges were gone, and the Orbán government has reached its original goal. So yes, independence of the judiciary is absolutely vital, and this is why the European Union tries everything in order to defend the independence of the judiciary in countries like Poland and Hungary.
Thank you. We'll go to Maria and Heidi, just a minute each, and then we're going to wrap.
Yeah, so look, I agree in an independent judiciary. I'm still waiting for my cases all to go away so I can get my rights back, right? Well, maybe I shouldn't be saying things like that. Look, under Duterte, more lawyers were killed than journalists. So that kind of gives you an idea how important most of our judges were lawyers. So they were part of that. And I would say, as a caution for America, evading these confrontations makes rule of law weaker because you normalize impunity. You need to restore rule of law, which means you hold the line.
Yep. Heidi, come on in. Thank you, Maria.
I mean, look, as my colleagues have said here, going after the judiciary is key to this kind of regime. And what we're seeing from the Trump administration right now is quite scary. Direct attacks and threats of impeachment and other things against judges. They don't like what's happening in the courts, and this is setting up a situation that may be a very serious constitutional crisis about the independence of the judiciary. And we cannot allow this to happen without an outcry. We've got to hold that institutional line.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I want to thank all of our panelists. This was an important conversation. We had almost 100 questions. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to them all. We will send a recording to everyone who RSVP'd. We also will send some materials of everyone who is featured here today. If you want to learn more about what you can do to stand up for freedom and democracy, please text FREEDOM to 78748. You will get Free Press's text updates, and you can expect to hear from us in a couple days as we gather public comments against the FCC chair's latest censorship campaign. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.